Welcome to the Latino Newsletter podcast. This is your host, Michelle Zacarias. Today, we're joined by Andrea Flores, one of the leading experts on U.S. immigration policy. Andrea has advised lawmakers across multiple administrations, including serving as chief of counsel to Senator Robert Menendez, and served as an immigration advisor both under the Obama and the Biden administration. She has led national immigration advocacy at the ACLU, worked on DACA, and the 2013 Senate immigration bill under Obama. A native of Las Cruces, New Mexico, Andrea is a graduate of Harvard University and Columbia Law School. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thanks for having me.
So let's talk a little bit about your background. I know through your Substack and the stuff that you've published, you grew up in New Mexico, where there was this large or prominent presence of federal border enforcement. How did those early experiences shape your understanding of border policy and ultimately lead you onto this pathway in your career?
I grew up along the US Mexico border and in southern New Mexico, and it really shaped everything about my American experience. My family is Mexican American. They've lived on both sides of the borders for generations across Arizona, Texas, California. And growing up in that region, there was a time when you could cross the border to see my family in Ciudad Juarez, and it was an easy process. And it felt that the border was sort of, it's a regional lively zone. But after the attacks on September 11th, Washington, D.C., really wanted to crack down on immigration, crack down on border security, and really started to build up and change a lot of the character of border communities. And so I remember the first time Border Patrol stopped me. I was leaving my middle school. I was 12 years old and really confused. I'm a US citizen. I did not know in middle school. I was showing them my middle school ID. And that very first experience was a first of many of having encounters with Border Patrol. And growing up, they used to be in the grocery store, they used to be in our Target. They were just a presence. And it really made me start to question what were the decisions that Washington made that led to so many officers policing US citizens and stopping them for looking and being Latino. And so I wanted to work in immigration policy really from that moment on and did so and was really lucky to work for President Obama on this issue right after college and was really at a young age entered the Department of Homeland Security and started seeing for myself, like, what did the immigration system really consist of? How did it work for people? How did it not work for people? And working at that time was amazing, right? It was a time when both parties were really trying to do immigration reform. It was a time when people thought that immigration was going to be the key to winning the Latino vote. So it was a priority. And really, the story of my career is how it went from being a priority to being one of the most controversial issues in American politics. And so that has been quite the experience, but I still, to this day, work every day wanting to reimagine how it could work both for border communities, but really for the country as a whole. I think we could just be doing so much better in designing an immigration system that makes sense.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you mentioned this experience growing up, being accosted by immigration enforcement, because I think oftentimes there's this misunderstanding that what's happening now at a widespread level wasn't happening before, right? And you're one of the people that can attest to that. Um, I think I'm wondering, having had that experience firsthand, was it difficult to trust getting into this line of work? I know there was like an inspiration to get in it and change things, but did you at all feel hesitant working under, say for example, like the Obama administration, who was notoriously known for kind of at the time being like an enforcer of immigration policies?
I felt that given my family history, I think about my grandmother growing up in LA as an immigrant. And she was alive the last time the United States did mass deportations, right? So when under the Eisenhower administration, they were harassing Mexicans in LA. and wanting them to show their papers and trying to coerce them to leave. And growing up, I heard those stories. My grandfather was undocumented, and my parents were the first to go to college, and they were the first to get graduate degrees. And I felt that I had this responsibility to actually go into government and really try and shape the system from within, which was a hard choice to make for the reasons that you said. This system had not been good to my family or my community. But I really was interested in learning how to change it and going to law school and learn how to change it. And it's been really my focus. But yeah, there's been many moments where I question, is this aligned with my principles? Am I making the system better? Am I part of making the system do violence to my community? And when I've reached those moments where I felt that a line has been crossed, have been times that I've had to step away from this work. And I am a US citizen, I'm Mexican American. It is the most American and patriotic thing I can do to work on immigration policy. But let's just take what's happening right now, right? They're targeting major cities with large Mexican American communities, large Mexican immigrant communities. That is my job to try and protect them, right? So it's all very connected and it's personal in that way. But I have the privilege as a US citizen to use every single constitutional right and platform I have to not allow our country to descend back into the same mass deportations that my grandmother lived through.
Okay, there's this joke, right? Like in immigrant families, everybody always wants you to become either like a lawyer, a doctor, or an engineer. But the law seemed like such a useful tool at one point to kind of push back or fight back against injustice. And now we're seeing more and more a blatant disregard for the legalities of people's due process. Do you feel like there has been a significant shift? Like, do you feel more empowered in the policymaking aspect and the advocacy work? Or do you still feel that we have a strong strategy rooted in the law and order of like our country's founding principles, I guess?
Well, this ties a lot into what it felt like to be Latina in the Obama administration because I felt that I was working at a fairly high level. I was working at one point, in the White House and for the Secretary of Homeland Security, but I was treated differently because I wasn't a lawyer. And I already had some suspicion cast at me for being Latina. And so for me, I felt if I do not at least deeply understand the law, there are going to be barriers where people try and use that against me. And so I really wanted to understand how the system came to be, why the court treat immigration law the way they do, how what Congress intended over time made very little sense. That was what my legal education was about. And I was never very interested in litigating in the courts, actually, because Justice Sonia Sotomayor, she gave a talk at Columbia when I was there in law school. And she said, I wish I had gone into politics. And it really affirmed for me that I am not going to be the best fighter in the courts. I really want to fight this issue and shape it in a broader way than the courts allow, right? Because when you're oftentimes defending clients, that is some of the most righteous work you can do, right? If you're doing immigration law, you're protecting the very livelihood of individual people. But a lot of times, you're also implementing very broken laws and you're going up and you're participating in that very broken system. And I want to be in the line of every day thinking about how to redesign that system better. And so that's why I'm so proud to be a lawyer. I'm the first Latino lawyer in my family, and that means a lot to me. And I have that authority and comfort with the law, and I've litigated before. But I think my focus is fully on Congress and elected officials because they are the ones who will make it better.
Right. And it does oftentimes seem like it comes down to a fraction of legislators who get to make these massive decisions about the entirety of the country. I think, I'd love to hear more about, what were some of the wins or victories that you felt kind of continue to drive you when you first got into this line of work?
So going back to the Obama administration, and I had one victory in the Biden administration as well, but to be part of the team that conceived of and created the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program for DACA, was seeing just the best of what government could be when it wanted to move quickly, when it wanted to do something that was life changing for people, when there was momentum, when it was all about the people we were serving. And in some ways, that kind of ruined me, right? Because I saw what was possible. And that program was actually deeply imperfect, right? It was short term, it was only 2 years protection. It's fragile. We see right now the Trump administration is not even acknowledging deferred action sometimes for certain cases. It was never supposed to go on this long in the form that we created it. But I look back to that moment to remind myself that when you get into office, when any president gets into office, you have 4 years and you can do a lot in 3 months. And that's how long it took to create DACA. And like I said, it kind of ruined me because then I entered a different administration under Biden. And so I was ready to go. I said, we just lifted the first Trump administration. There's so much we can do. And it was very difficult. They felt very differently about immigration. And so you asked me earlier what it is like to go into these agencies that also do great harm, right? And I was working for the National Security Council. I fully was entering a totally different space where there were believe 10 Latinos at the time, and building a process that had never existed before, actually, at ports of entry. So going back to my ties to the border to try and bring back the people who had been trapped in Mexico under President Trump's Remain in Mexico program, right? There were 68,000 people. And I was building something every single day, and about 100 people would come in very orderly. They'd be COVID tested. They'd come in every day, and every single day that was a win. Every single day I knew that I was part of a process that was bringing people into safety. And that meant everything to me. And when that policy stopped, I knew that it was, that I couldn't keep doing the same amount of good. And so I've seen what it looks like when government really wants to do something. And I hold lawmakers and administrations to very high standards because of it. Because when I see them move slowly, I know they can move faster.
Right. And I think if this administration has shown us anything, it's that government can be very efficient when it wants, regardless of what side of the
Absolutely.
political spectrum you fall on. Like they were able to move in and start implementing things very quickly. I know that you had reservations about the approach that the Biden Harris administration had on immigration. And you've written about how you were especially critical of the 2014, I think, border crisis, right? Where there was a lot of exposure of like deep structural weaknesses in the policy. I think looking back, what would you say are some of the biggest lessons or takeaways from that period that you think still apply today?
If I could look back, right, and I have been, I've started a Substack to actually explore just some of what I've learned in my career. It's called America's Promise. And I'm doing a retrospective on a lot of my experiences. And so one of my lessons is that in 2014, the border really changed dramatically, right? So before 2014, the people crossing the border, say when I was growing up, were primarily Mexican. They're primarily men. They were coming for work. And the way our law is written, they can very easily be sent back to Mexico quickly, right? So you didn't see groups of people crowding in border communities. It was easy for the government to manage, putting aside whether that's how it should work. That's just how it worked. But in 2014, we started to see entirely new populations that our system was not at all built to keep safe, to welcome in, to assess their claims. And one thing I wish I had done is from that moment spend years then thinking how to reform that system. And I eventually did under the Biden administration. But the fact that Democrats didn't take seriously asylum reform as a need, given the way the world was changing, given the way people migrating was changing, right? Our border, I wish I could walk everyone down there and say, do you want to know why it looks chaotic? Because we've built these tiny rooms where we now want 100 people to stay in there and figure out how to assess why they're here, where they're from, do they have legal claims? It makes no sense. Think about an airport, right? We've created systems that are you can come in, you show your passport, you get questioned by an officer. Like those systems make sense. No administration has sat down and been like, how do we receive asylum seekers at the border? And I wish I had spent more time thinking about that earlier, because that was the number one problem for the Biden administration is they actually wanted to think about it, but they had all the same old broken tools, and it just consumed them, and it consumed them in a way where they couldn't think about the long time undocumented in the country. They couldn't think about other immigrant groups, and it hurt the whole issue. The border consumed everything. And I want people to better understand, if we want the border to be calm and orderly, we're probably going to have to build a different system.
Yeah, I guess I'm wondering whether that is the case for younger, fresher elected officials, and policymakers, right? Because I think what you described is like folks using a lot of the old tools, because they're not incentivized to try anything new. And the reality is we kind of keep voting the same people back into office. What do you think, in terms of changing or starting from scratch, right? Like, what would ideally be some of the initial steps towards a possible vision like that?
This is my favorite question because I think we're in a generational shift, especially in the Democratic Party, right? I don't want to be stuck in a conversation anymore about comprehensive immigration reform or the fights of 2013. I am so ready to look at the future and to acknowledge that we know what Americans really want us to do, right? They want an orderly border. They don't want mass deportation the way that it looks right now. They wanna bring in talent, right? They're telling us all the time what they want, yet Congress is over here having a conversation about the border, asylum reform, and oftentimes some of the old debates are about, can we have an asylum system or can we not? Can we legalize everyone all at once or can we not? Is the H-1B program good or is it bad? I wanna throw all that out, right? I wanna get back to immigration is good for the country, and immigration reform is about making the immigration system work better for Americans and immigrants both, right? Because when it works better for Americans, they get to see the benefits of how immigration coming to the United States improves their lives. And we're so bad at connecting those issues, right? And so you can look at what's happening right now in cities like Chicago. I don't think most Chicagoans were sitting around thinking about the immigrant community, but now Trump is going in and taking the woman who's selling tamales and the construction workers, and it's really showing, these are not just immigrants, they're our neighbors, and I want the conversation around immigration reform to reflect what people experience in immigration every day, right? Right now, that's what they're experiencing. So right now, the solutions I'm interested in are, how can a small construction company sponsor their workers and help them get on a path to citizenship? I don't wanna get into old debates about old tools that we've not ever gotten past because they open up too many issues. I think a lot of people who have lost neighbors in their community don't even understand there's no legal way to keep them. We've built a system where if you have an immigration violation, you can be deported. That's the main consequence. There's nothing in between. And so I'm interested in that space in between. I'm interested in moving people to legal status. And I'm interested in building new visa pathways that actually tie into what the country wants.
Yeah, it's so interesting that you mentioned Chicago because I was actually born and raised there, and we have such a large, prominent Mexican immigrant community out there. And it actually is economically like one of the most sustainable, largest small economies that we have in Chicago, right? Little Village or La Villita. This is a neighborhood that's bringing, economic development. It is bringing culture, it's bringing tradition. But I do think because we are not necessarily like a traditional border town, right? Obviously, we exist on what's considered the US border, but it's not along the border of Mexico. Um People don't experience, I want to say, surveillance in the exact same way. Um so it's interesting that you brought that up. And I also wonder like what does it look like to have and address immigration in areas where there's large populations of immigrants. A lot of them are working in farms. How do we address the needs of those folks as they're coming in as well, right? Because they're also looking for work and resources. Um, and I like the thing that you said about there not being anything in between, because you're right. Like, once someone comes in and they don't have, say, like, quote unquote proper documentation, they are just inherently criminalized. I think there's a fundamental misunderstanding of pathways to citizenship, and that's always been a big hot topic. I'm wondering, like, for you, having, advised under so many different administrations, would you say there is a strategy around pathway to citizenship that you felt was more effective over what we have now or what we had previously?
No, it hasn't worked, which just means it's no fault of the people who thought of the strategy, but it means you need a new strategy. And Republicans are very good at making it seem that Democrats have all or nothing asks, right? So they use amnesty as an example and they say giving that away for free is wrong, right? It's very easy to vilify. But I'm very interested in thinking about a couple different strategies, right? So what if you had let's go back to housing and construction. What if you had just a program where people who work in housing and construction can be sponsored by their employers? Maybe they're undocumented, but that sponsorship can lead them to a green card. That's a path to citizenship. And then imagine the political support you build for that, right? You want construction companies to have a stable labor workforce. They're losing it right now. So put the pressure back and say, why wouldn't you want to keep this American workforce here? And I think we have to be comfortable experimenting in immigration policy. And I find, having worked in two administrations, that sometimes I sit in rooms and I can't believe I'm talking about the same thing that I talked about when I just graduated from college. And there needs to be fresh ideas, and we need to have them come from, let's look at another issue, say caregiving, right? And you think about baby boomers aging, we need care workers. Why aren't we talking about immigration being a solution to that? And I'll say those ideas for me come from, I try and get out of DC as much as I can. And I try and talk to people not in DC about the immigration topics on their minds. And I'll never forget a presentation I did. It was actually in Chicago. And the people who came said, all of our daycare centers are closing. Could you help us figure out how to recruit immigrants to Nebraska to keep those daycare centers open? And I didn't have an answer to them because we don't think of connecting, immigrants to communities in that way. Why not? And why don't we try and match up immigrants where they would be welcomed? And that's our system doesn't allow for that, but it could. And so you asked about sort of the rising generation of sort of new candidates. I'm really excited and I want to talk to them about these ideas because I don't want them to feel like all they can do is go on the debate stage and say, we'll do comprehensive immigration reform, because that didn't work. And I will say one of the reasons it didn't work is a lot of systems in America stay broken because they're actually not broken for everybody. And they're not broken for employers who benefit from undocumented labor. And that is what we have to remember until you can expose that further and show that there's people who criticize maybe guest worker programs, but that's because they're looking at the guest worker programs of the past too. And the reason I point that out is you can build a better guest worker program, right? Like I don't want to settle for things that have been broken and that don't make sense. And when you build a better guest worker program, guest workers aren't abused by their employers. When you build better visas that are actually easier for employers to use, they don't have to hire people who are undocumented. When you legalize and remove the incentives to exploit people, you have a better system. But this is not the way our immigration reform debate happens right now, right? It's sort of like there's a debate Washington wants to have, and then there's the experience everyone else has. And right now, I'm trying to bridge some of those.
It's so interesting because you mentioned that you've been almost having the same type of conversation since you started in this. And now we have sort of like a different threat that we're facing that also similarly falls under the same umbrella. What do you think is distinctly different about how people are now navigating the current administration and their livelihood and their ability to function as immigrants in this country.
It's been a really difficult year because if you looked at how the public and how elected officials responded to Trump's first term on immigration, you saw solidarity, you saw horror, you saw condemnation of immigrants being mistreated, mostly at the border at that time. And what's changed is the fact that immigration became deeply unpopular under the Biden administration, right? So Democrats came in, they had an opening to change politics on immigration. And from year after year, they showed a lot of inaction. They ignored the issue, they didn't talk about it. They very clearly didn't want to tackle the problem. And so, what was the narrative after the election? That immigration was one of Biden's worst issues. And so, at the beginning of Trump's second term, people really felt like he had a mandate for mass deportations. They felt like he had a mandate. And I remember very vividly the day that the administration sent over 200 Venezuelan men to El Salvador, to a prison where we knew then that they would be tortured, and talking to lawmakers who did not want to do anything because of the politics coming out of the Biden administration, because they were so afraid of accidentally defending someone with a criminal record or defending someone with a gang affiliation. It was really a heartbreaking moment. And right now, a report came out fully confirming what all of us knew back then, which these men experienced torture and human rights abuses. And what's been hard about this year is I worry that immigrants do not feel that there is a party or an opposition with them. And I worry that it has been trying to get people to fight for them again. And in my work, that has been very heartbreaking. But what has given me hope is following the deployments in LA. And there's no secret about how they're picking their cities, right? It's not just that they're blue cities, they're picking cities with some of the larger populations of Mexican Americans in the country. Right. They're going, if you look at Charlotte, has one of the bigger populations in the Mexican diaspora in Charlotte. And they're going and they're arresting citizens and they're testing these tactics. But what has given me hope is the local organizing. Like they have shown up, they are tracking, they are responding, they are not waiting for their elected officials to catch up. And so both in LA and in Chicago, and now I think we'll see this in Charlotte and in DC, we had our own deployment. That is what is different too, is local communities. We're not going to wait for, the governor to say something. Although I do think like some Governor Pritzker has been, at least he was in the streets, right? At least he was
Yeah,
showing up. And that's a huge difference. A lot of leaders are missing in action and the harm is so much greater. And that
yeah.
scares me and it makes me angry and fuels my work.
I actually recently did a report on what Southern California's elected leadership could be learning from Illinois and Chicago. You've got, folks like Mayor Brandon Johnson, who's been very vocal, very adamant. You've got Governor Pritzker, but you've also got a coalition of really progressive people who are at the front lines of a lot of things. You know, I think one of the things that you mentioned that's so important in the context of like Latinidad is this conversation that immigration became more unpopular during the Biden administration, and how, in some ways, that created almost like an anti immigrant sentiment within Latino communities. And so we're seeing, this wave of really, I would say, pro ICE Latinos, um, some who have joined the ranks. And it's kind of bizarre because you see folks who would otherwise probably be swept up in a raid now on the side of, DHS and ICE and Border Patrol. Do you feel like that in part due to what happened under the Biden administration, or do you feel like that anti-immigration sentiment has been kind of building up over the years?
So I'll use a specific example because I grew up in New Mexico that has been historically was actually more of a swing state, right? So when I was growing up, it voted two times for George W. Bush and then it two times for President Obama. And And why I point to that is that's a multi-generational, largely Mexican population. So doesn't map on as super progressive, much more centrist. And I do feel that a lot of political pundits don't really study our community. And I felt that I worked on the Hillary campaign and both administrations. I've often felt you're not even trying to learn about it. You're conflating a lot of us. And I'll use a very specific example under Biden is that they were so focused on the border. And then people who were coming across the border were Venezuelan, largely, right? That was one of the biggest populations. And so, what a lot of Mexican populations saw was that people crossing the border were getting work permits and legal status, something that they had been waiting since the Reagan administration for Congress to deliver to them. And so, what I feared that the White House didn't understand is because of the diversity of the Latino community, what they thought maybe Latinos would think was good policy was actually the complete opposite. Because they could have been giving those work permits to people crossing the border and fighting in Congress for legalization, right? There's ways to show that you're caring for both sides, but it's a lack of appreciation that, say, in the border community, a lot of anti-Venezuelan animus started to grow. And a lot of that also came from the fact that you didn't have anyone explaining to our community what was happening. The Venezuelan refugee crisis is the largest refugee crisis ever recorded in the Western Hemisphere. I don't think we heard that from many elected officials. And so if you think that they're just coming and getting things that your family has never gotten and you've been voting for Democrats across cycles, waiting for immigration reform, I think it's very normal that you're going to feel resentment for that. And that was a political failure of many of those policies. But it's also why setting policy is hard because you can be making sure that new arrivals can work, which is a good thing. But you can also be sending a difficult political message to your base. And I wasn't surprised by some of the resentment and belief that the new people were so different than existing Latinos. And we'd seen that before in history. We saw during the farm workers movement, there was a lot of resentment against new immigrants, right? We're complicated. We don't act as a block. And that confuses Washington a lot.
Yeah, yeah, we're absolutely not a monolith. And I think even you see that in the framing and the rhetoric of like immigrant versus migrant, right? The undertones there, like you said, some of that underlying resentment. I think that given your breadth of experience, you probably have seen the good, the bad, the ugly, all of it that comes with this. I'm wondering, moving forward, and especially as you talk about how there's been attempts to patch up a system that wasn't really designed for addressing today's migration patterns. Um, what do you hope to see now? You mentioned that there are a lot of local collectives and organizations on the ground that are doing really incredible work. But the outcome, hopefully, is that there is like some impact there, right? Something that changes at the policy level. How do you see those different entities that are working on different areas of immigration coming together in a collaborative way?
We really need Congress to get moving on this issue. And so we're heading into a midterm election year. And so when I think about what I would tell local groups in Charlotte, you have a Senate race and you have former Governor Cooper running. And my question is, as Charlotte experiences what is going to unfold, what is he going to go? If he's going to the Senate, is he going to be working on immigration reform and how is he going to address what just happened? Same in Illinois. Senator Durbin is retiring. There is a Senate primary. And there's actually a lot of different congressional primaries. And so really having those local groups say, if you want our votes and our support, this is one of the most urgent issues because I've worked in Democratic politics long enough to know, right? Most Democrats they're going to campaign on healthcare and affordability, and I support that. Absolutely. But they can do more than two things, especially when they get into office. And I want them to have an answer for these communities Because if we keep letting Congress not do anything, then we'll keep having this whiplash between administrations on immigration, and they'll keep using the same tools that make little sense. And that even when you do something good, say President Biden, piloted these legal pathways that helped people come in from Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, Venezuela. Those were good policies. But because of the way the law works, they're temporary and they leave people in limbo. And as soon as Trump came into office, he took away all their legal status. And we can't keep living this way. And so in this midterm election year, moving from immigration is toxic to really the local group saying, we absolutely reject, get over the 2024 election. We're living right now through this. Here's what we need. We need legal protections for our undocumented communities. We need you to stand up against racial profiling of Latino citizens. We need you to do reforms that make sense and that are permanent and that they're not going to be undone. And I hope to do that work and to help shape and find those leaders. And I think about Zara Mamdani in New York being proud and unashamed and seeing immigrants as just, he's an immigrant himself, part of the fabric. Like, we don't have to accept the politics of the last election going into the politics of the next one. And I think local groups are going to be leading the charge.
Wow, well, thank you so much for sharing that. I am
Yeah.
really excited to read more of your Substack and to see what else you have in mind for the coming months.
Well, thank you for having me. I love the Latino newsletter. I think we need more spaces where we can have honest conversations about how hard this issue has been, even for our community, and reaching agreement within. But I hope people don't give up and that they don't stop holding lawmakers, particularly those in Congress, accountable, because if we make it easy for them not to act, we will stay in this for years to come. And President Trump just has so many tools to do harm to our communities that we really have to start helping Democrats come up with that alternative. So I don't want people to give up hope. I think it's possible. I'm 15 years in, and I hope this conversation inspires others to join the work.
Great, thank you so much. And it's a wrap for today's episode of the Latino Newsletter podcast. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow us on social media. And for more stories that matter, follow the latinonewsletter.org. I'm your host, Michelle Zacarias. Until next time.
This episode of the Latino Newsletter podcast was produced by Joaquin Kotler, Juan Diego Ramirez, and Michelle Zacarias. It was edited by Julio Ricardo Varela. Music by a cast of characters via Soundstripe. Season 2 of the Latino Newsletter podcast was made possible through individual donations and the Latino Media Consortium. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the guests and hosts and don't necessarily reflect those of the Latino Newsletter or its staff.